Is it time? It's time to talk about Chicken Run 2, Dawn of the Nugget. As we all know, the original Chicken Run, released in 2000, was the most perfect piece of communist art ever made. The images of chickens trapped in a capitalistic hellscape, exploited to the point of cannibalization of their very bodies by a ruthless boss, and escaping, not through individualism, but through the sheer power of collective action. And a giant mechanical flying chicken. These images are seared into the collective imagination of several generations, and the central place that Chicken Run occupies in contemporary communist movements, the central place, meant that when I heard they were making a sequel, a volume 2 if you will, I was filled with anxiety. What if they mucked it up? What if they undermined the core communist messaging? What impact would that have on the tide of global radicalism? But now that I've had a couple of months to digest Chicken Run Volume 2, Dawn of the Nugget, I think it's probably time to explore whether Chicken Run 2 is communist. We'll talk about the dystopian setting reflecting the changes in the mode of production for the eras each movie deals with, the positioning of Mrs. Tweedy as that classic reflection of patriarchal fears, the femme fatale, and the theme of family abolition which infuses the film. As you can tell, I'm treating this with all the earnestness it deserves. I'm very warm already, so look forward to some sweat. So unlike the original Chicken Run, I don't expect everyone to know the plot to the sequel inside out. So let me take some time to go over some of the key plot details and themes at play. The film opens with Rocky retelling the history of the previous film.
I'm gonna tell you a story. It's all about the time we escaped from a chicken farm.
Yet it still seems like Rocky is still holding on to the lone free ranger individualism in his recollection of the revolution. He idolises Ginger as the revolution, shown by the imagery deployed as she stands as an almost Stalin-like figure. Ginger is the revolution, and the revolution is Ginger. This individualism prefigures the isolationist policy of the chicken commune as a kind of socialism in one country.
Those days are over, thank goodness. We've got our happy ending.
They've escaped the capitalist hellscape and created their socialist island paradise. They've achieved their goal. The revolution is over. It's revealed quite ironically though that Rocky is telling this valorization of the past to an egg holding the limitless potential of their child, the potential of the future.
You're never too young to learn where you came from.
This is the introduction of Molly as the symbolic holder of the revolutionary spirit. She is permanent revolution. And you can see how Molly's spirit of revolution is constantly hemmed in by Ginger and Rocky, and indeed the entirety of the Chicken's Island. This holds a couple of symbolic roles within the story. Firstly, as already alluded to, Molly's sense of revolutionary spirit contrasts with the ossified, secluded socialist paradise of the island. She and her spirit are birds, held in a gilded cage. Ginger's fear and trauma from escaping the capitalist prison is corrupting the goals of the revolution.
Can we go over there? Oh, we've spoken about this, Molly.
And this indeed connects us to a theme we'll discuss later, that of family abolition. Molly is owned by Ginger. She's not seen as her own person, but as a possession to keep safe. This informs Ginger's reactive and reactionary decision to hide once the evidence of deadly capitalist expansion is spotted by the island commune. And as an aside, it is no coincidence, I think, that the filmmakers show the spread of capitalist farms as being immediately prefigured by environmental destruction. Keep this in mind later as we discuss the dystopian setting of the new chicken farm. But regardless, now as they observe the spread of chicken farms analogous in my mind to capitalist imperialism, which should to a revolutionary like Ginger indicate that their socialism in one country is a flawed venture.
Well, it was only a matter of time before the humans showed up.
Bunty tells Ginger,
"You can't right all the world's wrongs, Duck."
but unlike in the original, Ginger believes Bunty's reactionary thought and calls on the chickens to hide.
We have to hide.
Huh? We can't risk our freedom.
We can't risk our freedom. Ginger is entirely blinded by the small piece of freedom that she has carved out for her and her family, that she cannot extend her solidarity beyond the gilded cage. But also, she can't see that hiding will never be enough. The spread of imperialism will eventually come to her too. And it's tragic to see this once blistering revolutionary become blinded to the world. And the cat agrees as well. Ginger has swapped one prison for another. And granted that the gilded cage of the island is incomparably better than the chicken farm, and I don't mean to make any trite comparisons claiming capitalism and imperfect communism are just as bad. Rather, we see the logic of repression of the prison replicated by Ginger in her clamping down of Rocky's freedom of expression.
Rocky! Given our new situation, maybe you shouldn't crow anymore.
We are reminded that revolution is a constant process, and even the most fiery of revolutionaries can replicate pre-revolutionary oppressions. And indeed, Ginger's refusal to allow Molly to learn about the oppressions and danger of the outside world leave her ill-equipped to understand the harm of Rocky's latent liberalism, as she declares that she wants to be a lone free ranger too.
I'm going over to see those trucks, because I am a lone free ranger. Like Dad was.
Without a proper understanding of the world and seeing the fear-driven reactive seeds of oppression sown by her mother, Molly begins to idolise the individualistic freedoms of liberalism. She's dazzled by the shallow commercialism displayed on the side of the chicken farm vans.
Oh, what is that? It's got a chicken sitting in a bucket on it. It's doing this.
The revolutionary project has never looked so shaky. Like her father before her, Molly escapes the cage on her own, but is, again, ill-equipped for confrontation with the outside world. She's almost mowed down immediately by the dazzling lights of an approaching van, and only rescued at the last second by another young chicken, Frizzle. And despite the fact that Frizzle is clearly barely more cognizant of the real world than Molly, herself idolising the commercialised life of the new modern bucket-based chicken farm.
Are you coming, Anna?
Coming where?
To the happy chicken truck?
You've seen them too?
Right.
She still makes quite the impact on Molly, and the queer undertones of this relationship are obvious for all to see.
Me and you, Kizer, all the way.
Both blinded by the promise of the commodity, the bucket.
What chicken doesn't want to have their own bucket?
I want a bucket.
Molly and Frizzle sneak their way into what they imagine is paradise, all the while they are being desperately chased down by their family, who know all too well the hollow horror of the world promised by the van's advertisement. And as Ginger and Co fail to catch up with Molly, we witness the evolving nature of the chicken farm as a representation of the changing form of capitalist development in the West. Rather than the traditional factory analogy of the original, a factory just entering the age of industrialisation, this new chicken farm is a high-tech prison office environment. The techniques of control are now no longer a simple fence, Mr. Tweedy and dogs, but an entire matrix of technology, a class of police and guards who exist to protect the commodities of the farm, and an eye-in-the-sky villain in the form of the tech-obsessed Dr. Fry. While Ginger has been hiding, the capitalist monster has been growing and changed into something unfamiliar and terrifying. And we get a view on the inside of this terrifying new chicken farm with Molly and Frizzle, and what they find is not the crammed life of the modern battery farm, but the dazzling distraction of the commodity-saturated modern world. With all the endless food and swings and rides, the chickens declare that
It's great, isn't it? We're free to do whatever we want.
Yet this is clearly a false freedom, as realise both that the chickens are being constantly surveilled and that they are lost in a Brave New World style Soma dream. Technology has been used to make them pliable and ready to be made, as the title indicates, into mass-produced nuggets. It's like that phrase concerning data mining. You know, when you can't figure out what a platform you use is selling, it's selling you. And in this case, that's not a metaphor. So while Molly starts to figure out that the life of the chickens in this dazzling farm dripping with commodities is not the dream she was sold, but a murderous nightmare, her mother and the chickens start mounting a daring escape. Fear for her child's life has awoken Ginger, spurred her into action once again, but she's still blinded by the individualistic ownership over her child. She's not ready to bring the revolution to the new farm, but kind of like Rocky in the first movie, is focused on breaking just one chicken out. This sequence, though, does also contain my favourite joke in the movie. Just great. It's just a great joke. So as Ginger's daring escape is underway, another cog in this machine is introduced. In another indication of how Dawn and the Nugget is about the devastating power of mass consumerism, it's revealed that Dr. Fry is meeting the proprietor of a chicken restaurant looking to become a franchise. Sir Eat-A-Lot, an old-school stuffy member of the British bourgeois, being dragged into the mass consumerist model as his business suffers the falling rate of profit. Just like the Tweedy's farm in the original.
And how's the restaurant business?
Actually, a little slow.
Oh, well, I think we can help you with that.
The birth of fast food can very much be seen as the birth of the automated, modern, industrialised, mass consumption society. A society defined by a massive accumulation of commodities. And you can see the reification of the commodity logic at work as the proprietor of the fast food chain, Reginald Smith, is constantly referred to by the moniker of the mascot of his restaurant.
Sir Eat-A-Lot.
The name is Reginald Smith. Sir Eat-A-Lot is just the name of the restaurant chain.
Capitalism stripping the humanity from even the bourgeois until they're nothing but avatars of capital. A no-figure in Chicken Run is a more twisted avatar of capital than the ultimate villain of the movie, walking slowly down the twisting modernist stairs. Mrs. Tweedy. Again. But Mrs. Tweedy has changed. Just as she's swapped the farm for this kind of modern office, so too has she updated her look to be a more glamorous, fashionable visage. Much like me. And as it is revealed that this Dr. Fry is a new husband of Mrs. Tweedy's, we get the distinct impression that she's now occupying a kind of femme fatale role in this story.
I see you've met my current husband, Dr. Fry.
Despite the traumatic effects that Mrs. Tweedy still holds over Ginger, and that seeing her reawakens, she's still driven to rescue Molly. And amidst a ghoulish demonstration of the mind control effects of the farm, Ginger finally catches up with her daughter, just in time to witness the terrifying creation of the first nugget.
She's won the prize. Have a nice time.
And we see Mrs. Tweedy spell out the modern mass consumption which drives this mass-scaled cannibalisation of chickens' bodies.
Modern people in a modern world. They want their food and they want it fast.
But Ginger's still not able to summon the revolutionary spirit, and amidst an argument with Molly, who wants to save her friend, she's caught by Mrs. Tweedy. After being caught, Tweedy explains the disdain she feels towards all chickens who rebel. Like all bosses, she can't see what could be wrong with exploiting workers and is now driven by a deep, personal hatred of them.
And Militia Tweedy will have her revenge.
Revenge?
Revenue.
Still, after a series of escapades and dances and Ginger being rescued by both Molly and Rocky, the group makes it to the escape route on the farm's roof. Finally though, when confronted with her daughter's despair, the Ginger from the original Chicken Run returns. While standing in the same idealised position as Rocky imagines her in the beginning, Ginger announces that she's going to return and free all the chickens.
I'm going back. For Frizzle and all the chickens.
Finally, she sees that no chickens will ever be free until all chickens are free. Finally, she sees that the revolution has to be global. No chicken is an island.
Just because where we live is cut off from the world doesn't mean we are too. No chicken is an island.
Solidarity with all chickens everywhere. Not coincidentally, I think this is also the moment that Ginger lets go of her ownership over Molly and allows her to make her own decisions. And so, against the ticking clock of the full-scale production or slaughter of the chickens, Ginger and the rest mount a daring breakout of all the chickens in Tweedy's farm, breaking the technological control over them and blowing up the farm in the process. And as we fade back into the chickens' home, we see it filled with all the new escapees, while they repurpose the oppressive technologies of the farm to fit new purposes, whether that's to make popcorn or as a kind of leisure drug.
This makes you happy and brainless, apparently.
Oh, yeah, I feel it. It's amazing.
A nice sort of incisive commentary on the use of technology in different modes of production. And as Rocky turns to Ginger to call this a happy ending, Ginger makes clear that
Let's just call this our happy beginning.
the work isn't done. There's still chicken farms out there to be liberated. The revolution has to be spread across the globe. And finally, we end on Rocky being able to freely express himself and all the chickens storming a battery farm.
Is crowing back on the agenda?
Oh, definitely. Ready, everyone?
No chicken is an island. The revolution is forever. So now that we've gone over some of the broad communist themes of the movie, I want to zoom right in onto some specific features that differentiate it from the original movie. And the first major difference is obviously the setting. You know, as already alluded to, the setting of Dawn of the Nugget differs from the traditional chicken farm setting of the original Chicken Run. You know, it's not a chicken run anymore. And now at first you might think that the most obvious route for the development of the chicken farm to travel in a Chicken Run sequel, which is, you know, so obviously preoccupied with mass consumption, would be to make the new farm an industrial battery farm, like the one Ginger and the gang liberate in the finale.
It's go time.
But I think this change to a sort of nightmarish, Brave New World, Soylent Green dystopia is actually quite astute. You know, as mentioned, the setting of Dawn of the Nugget is the 1960s. This is indicated by the decor of the chicken farm's office space and the chic dress of Mrs. Tweedy, who the creators described this time as the ultimate 1960s supervillain. And the context of the 1960s is actually quite important, because during the 60s, there was a visible surge in media depicting dystopia. You had Fahrenheit 451, Alphaville, The Last Woman on Earth, and many more. And the surrounding decades of the 50s and 70s also had works which are clearly touchstones for Dawn of the Nugget, with Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956, and Soylent Green, in which environmental destruction leads to the industrial cannibalization of humans, turning them into processed blocks of nondescript food. Clearly relevant, and it was released in 1973. All of these dystopian films represented the sort of anxieties produced by the rapidly modernising world, especially in the industrialised West. They frequently reflected fears of environmental destruction, of technological advancement, automation, and, unfortunately, also Cold War fears of totalitarian communism. And so, in my view, the setting of Dawn of the Nugget is quite consciously making reference to that era of filmmaking, and thus referencing the anxieties produced by capitalism. So let's begin this discussion, however, outside of the chicken farm, with the fears of environmental disaster. Much like the environmental disaster which plagues Soylent Green, we get a reminder that the very first signs of the expanding domain of capitalist imperialism is the destruction of the environment. But it's not simply that capitalism destroys the natural world, but that an alienation is established between the human and the natural. The birth of the modern world is linked to an increasing artificial difference set up by the mass consumerism of capitalism between humanity and nature. And this is established by the very subject matter of the film, Dawn of the Nugget. Just as trees are felled to make room for sterile office-like slaughterhouses, so too is the production of meat sterilised and distanced for humans. Unlike the grim scenes in the original where Mrs. Tweedy uses an axe to decapitate an unproductive chicken to consume her corpse, in Dawn of the Nugget, the chicken chosen to demonstrate the nugget machine rises on an escalator and disappears behind a curtain, and then just emerges as something so distant from chicken that's hard to even identify as such. It's a clear development from the pie-making machine of the original.
Chickens go in, pies come out.
Except more sophisticated and more alienated. It's representative of a modern historical epoch of capitalism which came with its own anxieties. It is so clearly a direct reference to the dystopia of Soylent Green.
You gotta tell them, Soylent Green is people!
But more than just the industrial slaughter to produce food and the alienation between humans and nature, the construction of the chicken farm itself is clearly a reflection of modernist dystopian fears. One of the consistent features of dystopian media of the 1960s, according to Kizer, is that of the earlier promise of technological utopianism turning into a terrifying techno-dystopia. Think, for example, of the optimism of Keynes, who in the 1930s believed that productivity gains from technology would lead us to a world of relative leisure. Or even the supposed labour-saving household gadgets of the 50s, which supposedly would free women from the shackle of housework. Neither of these utopian dreams came to fruition, and indeed both became vectors of anxiety in the mid-20th century, as many working-class men feared being pushed out of work by automation, while working-class women were forced to continue shouldering the brunt of household labour while entering the workforce, leading to patriarchal fears of working women too. Dawn of the Nugget very effectively showcases the trend of utopia turning to dystopia. The commercial dream sold to Molly and Frizzle and the other chickens via advertising is very quickly revealed to be a dystopian facade.
So this isn't the best place ever. You only get your own bucket when they've chopped you up and cooked you.
While there is readily available consumption for the chickens in the farm, such consumption is as much a facade as the fake hills and skies of the farm. The farm area actually reminds me of like a McDonald's play area. Mass consumerism just seeps through the design of it. And not only are there chickens being kept there to be processed into nuggets, but they're subjected to mind control technology and the constant Big Brother style surveillance.
Lovely sunshine. No, wait! Hold on to her.
And at first I thought that the mind control undermined the anti-capitalist messaging of the film, because we could effectively understand the bribing of workers with a glut of commodities as just the way in which workers' struggle are pacified in the global north. But when we understand this as a dystopian movie, it all makes much more sense. The fear of technology as a mode of social control combined with the mass consumption isn't directly analogous to the lives of the working class. Like, no one's being literally mind controlled. But it's reflective of the fears associated with modernity and expressed through the films of the era. The Marxist critical theorist Herbert Marcuse analyses these fears in his 1964 book, One-Dimensional Man, where he identifies the use of technology, media, mass consumption and ideology as a new form of social control. He identifies this as a form of capitalist totalitarianism, and it's these new forms of social control which inspired the anxieties of the technological dystopian films. There have been a number of dystopian sci-fi works which rest on such mind control themes. The Soma and Brave New World acts as a drug to keep the population pliant, while the replacement of pod people in Invasion of the Body Snatchers is not exactly mind control. The mind-controlled chickens evoke the same sort of feeling of fear when faced with someone who looks like the person you know, but isn't them, and only wants to conform to the societal standards of modernity, of everyone around them.
I love it here. I'm so happy. No.
So, upon reflection, I actually think that this mind control aspect of the film can work quite well to communicate fears of capitalist conformity which emerged in the mid-20th century but remain relevant and, maybe more relevant than ever in this era of pervasive tech surveillance. Constant surveillance of everything. We're being watched everywhere. I live in London, the most watched city in the world. But before moving on, I want to talk briefly about how Dawn of the Nugget actually supersedes many of the dystopian fictions of the era that it's aping. As mentioned, many of the dystopian fictions of the 1960s were responses to the anxiety not of just capitalist control, but of the perceived threat of totalitarian communism too. Anti-communism in the US created a fear of technologically advanced state communism. This led to certain kinds of liberalism and how these stories tended to end. In the dystopia, a solution often appears in the self-same bourgeois values the film seemingly attempts to invert, from the return to the Enlightenment values represented by the literature in Fahrenheit 451, to the sentimental redemptive power of love in Alphaville, and of human connection in Playtime. As in other films, with escape endings including Fahrenheit 451, the conclusion of work is a four-letter word features Valentine and his wife Betty venturing off into a forest, representing a return to the natural world. Dawn of the Nugget could easily have fallen into the same liberalism. The chickens could have returned to their island and lived a kind of naturalistic ending. But this is Chicken Run. Instead, the liberalism of the classic dystopias is fully rejected as Ginger and the others realise that the only way to end the dystopia for good is through global revolutionary action. There is no individual escape, and in fact, individual escape is considered and roundly rejected.
Just because where we live is cut off from the world doesn't mean we are too. No chicken is an island.
This dystopian story escapes the bourgeois roots of many films it's indebted to by simply being revolutionary. It's communist. I want to talk now about another feature of Dawn of the Nugget that pays homage to an era of 60s filmmaking and the anxieties produced by that era of capitalist modernity. Mrs. Tweedy is a femme fatale now. So I spoke at length in my video on the original Chicken Run about how Mrs. Tweedy represented a kind of vicious capitalistic feminism, utilising classic imagery of female domesticity to more effectively profit, and at one point ripping off the mask of this domesticity to reveal an axe-wielding capitalist monster. This time round, however, Mrs. Tweedy appears less as a criticism of that kind of utilisation of womanhood under capitalism, and more as a expression of the patriarchal anxieties of capitalist modernity. As Chicken Run director Sam Fell put it, this is the ultimate 1960s supervillain. The position of the femme fatale has been fraught in feminism. Some have argued that it's a fundamentally misogynistic construction. Hypersexualised, dangerous, greedy women ready to tear down all the men around them. Others, however, have argued that the femme fatale is a symbol of women gaining independence in the context of being freed from their confinement in the household and utilising the power of femininity to beat the patriarchal system. Regardless of whether or not it's misogynistic, there is broad consensus that the femme fatale figure gained prominence as a reaction to the changing position of women in capitalist society in the mid-20th century. The manner in which women establish newfound independence following their inauguration into the workforce during the war caused a sense of confusion concerning the roles of women and men in the workplace and at home. The confusing status of women in society at that particular moment in history is reflected and mirrored in the duplicity of the femme fatale character in film noir, whose alluring and innocent outward appearance masks her corruption and deviance. The character's consistent deception in film noir acts as a metaphor for how women are obliged to function and act in a patriarchal traditional society, alongside a hunger for independence that results from this oppression. I think that we can very clearly see Mrs. Tweedy in Dawn of the Nugget as representing those patriarchal anxieties about the position of women in capitalist modernity in the mid-20th century, but also as films like Gone Girl demonstrate anxieties which persist to this day. Immediately before Mrs. Tweedy is revealed as the ultimate villain of the story, we're treated to a sort of 1960s style cartoon which places the mother as the central figure of homemaking.
This is the most delicious chicken in the whole wide world. I love you, Mummy.
Thank you, science.
A child hates her cooking, and suddenly the avatar of mass consumption, nuggets, appear, which both pleases the child and saves the mother. She's completed her role as a mother through labour-saving consumption. Then, as the traditional English bourgeois questions the reality of the nugget, Mrs. Tweedy's voice rings out.
That's a clever little cartoon, Dr. Fry. But will you be able to do it?
We already have.
She descends the modernist stairs. No longer a farmer's wife, but a cutting-edge 1960s woman of industry, dressed in the fashion of the age. Mrs. Tweedy then goes on to explain how she's achieved this wonder of modern consumption.
Was I attracted to his large inheritance and vast acres of land? No. It was his mind. But he's a genius.
And notice here some key phrases which highlight her position as a femme fatale. She describes Dr. Fry as her current husband, which, you know,
I see you've met my current husband.
And makes direct reference to the vast fortune and acres of land. These are classic fears of fortune-hungry black widows. Even while she says she disregards the vast fortune, she still makes it quite clear that Dr. Fry is there just to be used in her pursuit of profit/revenge.
And Militia Tweedy will have her revenge.
And you know, as a side note, revenge seems like a pretty standard femme fatale motivation too. We also frequently see in Mrs. Tweedy the use of sexuality to pursue her aims. In the case of Dawn of the Nugget, this sexuality is sometimes given a sort of Freudian psychosexual edge.
I love you, Mummy.
Throughout the movie, it's made quite clear that Mrs. Tweedy is looking to move on from Dr. Fry now that he's given her what she needs, you know, the techno chicken farm. And now she's beginning to seduce her next target, Reginald Smith, for his access to the restaurant business. In many instances, Mrs. Tweedy and Reginald Smith get into intimate positions, sometimes interrupted by Dr. Fry, sometimes not.
With my nuggets and your chain of restaurants, this is going to be a beautiful partnership.
In one obvious instance, Reginald offers Mrs. Tweedy dip in an engagement ring box.
Why, Reginald, this is all very sudden.
In another, as Reginald tastes the nuggets for the first time, he says,
I love you, Mummy.
Freud is just activating, just leaping out of his coffin. Truly, Mrs. Tweedy is Mother-geddening across the slaying house floor or whatever. But as is quite obvious, Mrs. Tweedy is not positioned as an ideal. While she clearly runs rings around all the men in her world, she is clearly smarter, more driven and more powerful than them. She's also an unyielding villain. And I feel like when we position her against my final point in this video, we get something quite interesting. So Mrs. Tweedy's use of the family through husbands and seduction and her obsession with revenue/revenge shows how despite gaining power over these men, she's still subject to the power of capital and will therefore fail in the face of revolution. She's still bought into the family, but as a structure she believes she can manipulate to her own benefit. Mirroring this, however, is the relationship between Ginger and her daughter Molly. At the beginning of the movie, Ginger appears as your standard mother of a small child. She worries, she chases her, and she ultimately tries to, hem her in. Steadily though, as the dangers of the outside world begin to encroach, Ginger's perception that she owns Molly is made more and more clear, with Ginger even accepting her role as a boss over Molly.
You're not the boss of me.
Actually, I am.
Truly heartbreaking for a revolutionary to become a boss. Heartbreaking. She not only commands Molly's life, but finds ways to turn her life into a prison. Ginger can't lose her possession, so she simply has to infringe her autonomy. And indeed, it takes until the very end of the film for Ginger to let go of her parental control over Molly and let her make her own decisions to join the revolution.
What's the plan, Mum?
Oh, well, I didn't think you...
Are you sure you're ready for this?
I was hatched ready, Dad.
Not coincidentally again, this is the moment that Ginger recognises that the revolution has to continue beyond the confines of those she immediately cares about. In valuing the personhood of her daughter, beyond the fact that she's her daughter, she values the personhood of all chickens everywhere. And so while Mrs. Tweedy clings to the family as a means to gain personal success, Ginger lets that very notion go, in favour of the revolution and more fully appreciating Molly as a person separate from herself. And there are other inklings throughout that this film offers a critique of the family as a structure. Firstly, despite Ginger's control over Molly in the beginning, it is also clear that she is a child of the community. This is made clearest when she refers to the rats as uncles, which moves them so profoundly that they repeatedly make clear that they absolutely love Molly and would do anything for her.
She just called me uncle. Steady, mate. Steady. But I never had a family of my own. Anything for our little Molly.
The family is extended far beyond the confines of the nuclear unit, which is another anxiety of the 1960s and one which is ongoing. While extending the family is not the same as abolishing it, which is a process whereby social reproduction is no longer confined primarily to the family or to the market, this extension does represent a weakening of the effective control that Molly's immediate family has over her. She has a whole community to care for her. As a final thing which I think indicates that there's some family abolitionist critique in this film, is the obvious queer overtones between Molly and her definite girlfriend Frizzle.
Me and you, Kizer. All the way.
This effectively contrasts with Mrs. Tweedy's utilisation of romantic love to pursue her own success. And so, while very clearly queer relationships are not necessarily family abolitionists, and the notion of the queer family has been, quite effectively co-opted by heteropatriarchy, it is indisputably the case that queerness has been set up as a threat to the dominant nuclear family structure, and still is. This was, in fact, quite a common anxiety in the 1960s as men left factories and entered feminised office work. Suddenly, queer feminine men were seen as a threat to a strong nuclear family. And in the context of a movie so dripping with the imagery and anxieties of the 1960s, the presence of a happy queer love story in contrast with the horrendous exploitation of Mrs. Tweedy's marriages can effectively be read as a critique of the heterosexual nuclear family. So, Ginger learns to love Molly for who she is as a person, separate from Ginger herself. The bounds of care are expanded far beyond the limits of the biological family, and queer love is celebrated against the destructive nature of heterosexual marriage. As Emmy O'Brien writes, "In a free society beyond capitalism and beyond the family, we can finally know what it means to love and be loved." So, is Chicken Run Dawn of the Nugget communist? Well, let me be clear. It's not quite as solid a piece of communist propaganda as the original. That still holds up, it still holds the title of indisputably the best communist propaganda ever produced. But when we look at it carefully, when we look at the movie carefully, we can see that there's some very strong aspects of communist propaganda at play. But fundamentally, nothing confirms my interpretation that Dawn of the Nugget is communist more clearly than the fact that the whole thing culminates in a call for expanded revolutionary action to liberate all the people, chickens, of the world. Some unenlightened people reject my message that the original is communist by saying, with blinkered eyes, that it's just a prison break parody. But no one can make that argument for Dawn of the Nugget. It is an explicit call for solidarity and revolutionary action across the world. Dawn of the Nugget, dawn of the revolution. Was that okay? Good. No, I think they'll hear it this time. No, of course, I will. Shout out to my friend Menzies, for no other reason than he's a good guy, and I said I'd do this for him when I saw him. There's to you, Menzies. I hope this was a video that you wanted, me in a chicken costume. Enjoy. Yeah. No, I mean, Alright, thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this and all found it convincing, because otherwise the chickens on the phone are going to come and break my legs. So, please make sure you liked it. And if you did like it, like and share and all that. And sign up to my Patreon if you want to see some more stuff. We get some early access and some, more writing, book reviews and stuff. The next one should be on family abolition text. And also $10 and up patrons get their names read out in the credits. So here we go for those guys whom I love with all my heart. Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Soval Hayes, Earl Grey Tea, Bonnie, Katie Marshall, Nina G Public Relations, FD Signifier, Lizzie G, Quint Wolf, Kim Crawley, Anita Anisby, Ellisrin, Sophie, Hey Joe, Cameron Blakemore, Misling, Cyril Smid, Rachel Ann, Melanie Estes, PJ Lisbirrell, Layum, Xander Converse, Faya Westfall, Jack, TB Skyen, Christopher Poff, Morgussie, Daniel Cusid, Joshua Moldenhauer, Tom Price, Kate Soiree, Esoteric Fictionalism, Austin Talman, Robin, Rachel Nixon, Michelle H, Rich, Duncan Skinner, Niels Abelgard, Tinfoil Pancake, Kieran Gore, Agga Ghost, Barney Carroll, Joel, Daniel Hughes, Nelly Zacheva, J. Fraser Cartwright, Aaron and Tamash Kispeter, and Paul Singleton. But yeah, if you like this, then consider signing up, and please enjoy me acting as if I'm on the phone. Alright, cheers, love you. Alright, that'll do. Bye.